Talking about all that stuff can be a little bit emotional. It took me a really long time before I could even talk about those things without crying. It feels pretty good to have distributed that information, to have finally gotten that off my chest. I had some creative ideas that came to my imagination on how I could expand on that, and I have the intention to continue to keep talking about these things, and it brings my heart a lot of satisfaction to be speaking about these things and bringing them out into the open. And I'd like to share how I came to the conclusion that there was any trauma in my life is there was a time where I would have the experience of blacking out, or maybe blackout is not the exact good word, but it's like I would suddenly not remember like basic everyday things or certain experiences. And so I knew somehow that blacking out was correlated to having trauma. And so I set the intention to remember the most traumatic thing that I could think of. And so I went to that suppressed memory, and in that suppressed memory was the memory of being a 15-year-old kid and sleeping over my friend Kobe's house, and his brother Ariel entered into the bedroom I was sleeping in, and he did things without my consent. He touched me while I was sleeping, and for a long time I suppressed this, and I downplayed it and misrepresented it to myself, saying, oh, I was just molested, it's no big deal. But as I got older, I realized that that was statutory rape, and it was very traumatic because I woke up covered in my own blood, and it was just very overwhelming. And at the time when I told his brother, and I told my friends that were also sleeping over the house, they were all older people who insinuated that it was my fault, or that of course that would happen to me because I was flaunting my sexuality. And I really believe that something happened to me, done to me by my uncle, who was known to have done things to other his sisters specifically. And there was also an experience that I had that at that time I had no spiritual education at all. But even in my childhood, I really thought that it was something demonic or something dark or some type of curse. And as I grew older, I learned that this is called not just epigenetic memory or ancestral trauma, but it's also called a generational curse. And they're also called ancestral curses. And there's a lot of scriptural references of this. And on that night where that happened to me, a very similar event happened to my mom, where she also woke up, where she had a similar experience where it wasn't blood, but it was someone's spit. And I never had the courage to tell my mom what had happened. I didn't want to hurt her. And I don't think I've ever really to this day actually had an emotional conversation with my mom about this, because I know she would get very mad. And I love and care for her very much, but I do know for a fact in my spirit these are spiritual contracts or things that were part of our lineage. And I'm pretty sure the same thing happened to my grandma, and I wouldn't be surprised if it kept happening throughout generations. And there's different doctrines that mention different reasons that this happens. One of them that comes to mind is doctrine of Balaam, and I'm still very, very new in my education in this, so I'm not a minister, so I don't really know these things, but I have had the experience of being ministered to. And doctrine of Balaam might not even be the exact one that is connected to this, but that is the one that was brought to my mind's eye. And I'm still in the process of getting these things cleaned up, you could say. Like, sometimes when I talk about them, I get brought back to that childlike regressed state. And it's very challenging for me, especially because there was a huge part of me who completely dissociated and didn't want to talk about these things and didn't think I would ever talk about them. But I've recently been inspired to create educational content, kind of also just being truthful of what my experience was. And at this moment in my life, I kind of feel a sense of gratitude of having those experiences, because it put me into a position where I'm able to have extreme empathy for other individuals who have also been sexually assaulted. And something else that I thought was really fascinating as I started to study psychology is that if you look up signs or symptoms that a child has been sexually abused, the child will begin to recreate these experiences or to express sexuality at it's called an underage state, yes. In some countries and things like this, there might be personal interest in a different form of sexuality. And I'm not going to really go into those things, but we all know how corrupt the world is, and these type of trafficking industries that exist, and these, you could say, very fallen or a sick world. And I would encourage anyone who notices a child who is going through these experiences and that is expressing sexuality to just know that sometimes the child is recreating the abuse that was done to them. So if your child is expressing sexually towards other children, perhaps consider that there might be someone or another child who might be influencing this. And perhaps the child is also exposed to certain media. I mean, there's a lot of different references, and some of it is absolutely normal and part of human expression, right? So I'm not here to shame or convince anyone of anything. I'm just here to share my own personal testimony and what this experience was like for me. And one more thing that I will add is I really believe that part of my self-expression as a teenager, when I would express being very gothic and shaving my head, it was a really rebellious act, and assuming that if I dressed this way that I would scare people off and that people wouldn't find me attractive and that I would be safe. However, instead I just attracted a bunch of different people who were attracted to my brokenness, and some who were even interested in taking advantage of my brokenness. And so there's been healing and processes happening around that. And in some levels there was some self-abandonment and self-rejection because there was an unacceptance of what happened to me. And as I've called it before, I was discounting what had happened to me and dissociating from what was happening to me. And for me personally, I would escape through smoking cannabis and just coping any way that I could, unconsciously going on and moving through life and compartmentalizing. But now, as I've continued my education and I've sat with myself for a very long time, I've come to witness some of these things, and it feels like it's the right time to tell the truth and to be in unity with the world. And for me personally, I'd really love to have a sense of freedom to be able to communicate and an intimate connection with my family, and not in any negative ways. Like, I'd love to have a healthy relationship with my mom, to be able to talk to each other without argument, and to really almost like be friends instead of parentification. And it's very easy to become dysregulated just by even talking about some of these things. So sometimes it takes me time to get back to a state of complete mental health and being really happy. However, at the same time, to suppress and to express these things can be a little bit too much sometimes, and sometimes it just feels like it's for the best to be going in this direction that I'm going now. And I have complete compassion and forgiveness